any millennial or any person who has a friend or relative or family member who's a millennial understands that student debt is a crushing burden for many Americans. In fact, for Americans in a lot of age groups, including some over 65. But student debt is a large and growing problem in this country, and our next guest has done some exhaustive research into it, and he's here to talk to us about it. Marshall Steinbaum is research economist at the Center for Equitable Growth, and he is the co-author of a new study on the geography of student debt. Marshall, thanks so much for joining us.
No problem. Glad to be here.
Listen, I think the study that you co-authored is an important one. As I understand, it was jointly produced by the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, Generation Progress, and Higher Ed Not Debt. And you mapped student debt as part of that effort. Tell us what you think some of the significant takeaways were from this research.
Well, I think that what the data show most starkly is the dichotomous geography of student debt within metropolitan areas. So we know that the socioeconomic patterns in the United States are reflected in the geography of our metropolitan areas. Unfortunately, we face residential segregation and income segregation, and what we see in these maps is exactly that the geography of student debt mirrors that, and that has, I think, implications for the policy of student debt as a way of financing higher education, but also on sort of larger questions about inequality and about the labor market.
Right. I think one of the striking things about what you found, speaking to that point, is that, for example, here in the Washington, D.C. region, that, people might somehow assume that people with very high student debt are the most likely to default. But one of the things that you found is that people with lower levels of student debt, but who live in areas of the city with lower incomes were more likely to default. So in other words, the larger the debt doesn't mean the larger the likelihood of default. The people with the smaller debts are more likely to default because they live in, or with some relationship to the fact that they live in lower income neighborhoods, right?
Yes, exactly. I think that what we've done effectively is tell people who might not have the best labor market opportunities and may have faced poor schooling earlier in their lives that the solution to their problems is to take on student debt and to acquire some measure of post-secondary education, often from the for-profit sector, and essentially that is a misdiagnosis of the economy's problems. Having more degrees is basically no help when there aren't any jobs. And on the contrary, if you've financed increasing your educational attainment with debt, what you end up with is no jobs and a lot of debt. So in that residential, or in that geographic variation that we see in these student debt maps, what we're seeing is essentially the amplification of longstanding inequities in terms of access to the labor market, access to efficient credit markets, rather than sort of the privately provided student debt, which tends to be much higher cost to borrowers. The people who lack access to those economic opportunities are the ones who end up defaulting on their student loans, and I think that really, as I said, reflects policy errors on the part of policymakers and just general academic diagnosis of what the labor market's problems are.
So to a certain extent, meaning in effect, and we're talking with research economist Marshall Steinbaum, meaning in effect, if I understand you correctly, that there's been an assumption that education by itself, higher education, is a solution to the employment problem. But if you come, let's say, from a minority neighborhood where perhaps racial disparities in employment are a huge factor, and you get an education, you may wind up with student debt and still no job.
Yes, and I think we're also we haven't exactly provided data on the question of dropouts. We hope to do that in a future map, but what I think a lot of people discover is that they're enrolled in higher education and there really aren't the job opportunities available that make it worthwhile to continue to take on debt, and so they drop out. And that has been interpreted elsewhere in the media and in some places in academia as sort of a lack of stick-to-itiveness on the part of the people who should just be finishing college, because labor market outcomes for those who do finish college are much better than those who don't. I think that fails to really apprehend the situation that lots of people who are currently taking on student debt to attend some form of post-secondary education, what has been called non-traditional students, their actual situation is such that maybe telling them that you should stay in college because that's what's best, because the people who previously graduated from college are doing well, is a little bit ignorant.
So is it possible then that there's a kind of selection effect that took place that people misinterpreted? In other words, when people were saying, we look at this data and we think that college degree increases your income and your likelihood of an employment, they weren't thinking about the fact that looking back historically, that kind of self-selected, for example, to white people who have better job prospects anyway, or people who might have better job prospects for other reasons, and that therefore the answer was not just spreading college education around along with the debt that goes along with it in our country right now, but the real problem, the underlying problem, was racial discrimination in hiring.
Yes, I mean, I think that's not the only one underlying problem, but by and large, that interpretation is the right one, yes.
And now at the other end of the income spectrum, you have people with much higher student debt who are actually not, or defaulting at much lower rates, graduate students and so on. So one of the explanations you point out is that people who have graduate degrees will have larger student debt, doctors, lawyers, accountants, and so on, MBAs, but they will also have better job prospects and better income, be less likely to default. But is there? Were you able to look at the racial mix of that as well to see to what extent that might play into it?
That's an excellent question. We haven't yet published any specific findings about the racial aspect of either delinquency or of student loan balance amounts or of payment amounts, but that's exactly what we're planning to do in the next map. So I referred previously to sort of our future plans for data publication, and we will be covering race, education attainment, home ownership, access to credit, and labor market outcomes in future maps.
We're talking with research economist Marshall Steinbaum. And Marshall, this is going a little bit out of the research, so, respond or not as you see fit. But it struck me reading your report that the interpretation that you guys are challenging with your data, which is basically if you just went out and got an education, you meaning in this case perhaps inner city residents or whomever, that you would do as well as quote unquote we are doing, that there's a kind of an assumption that it's the fault of the individual rather than some systemic problems underway, such as discrimination. I'm wondering the extent to which you reflected on that at all, or that's just my own spin on it.
I would endorse that spin, even if it is spin. I think that's right. I think there's an inclination to blame the victim, as it were, for economic problems and it's especially offensive to my mind, to be frank, on the part of my fellow economists, whose job it is to figure out how the economy works and potentially to prescribe policies that reflect on the realities that we observe as to the workings of the economy, and then specifically why some populations may not have economic outcomes that we could sustain. I think that people have rushed to these sorts of solutions or these sorts of prescriptions that you refer to that blame the victim, and the tragedy of that is that then they say, okay, well, the solution is to go get educated, and everything will be fine in the labor market, and people do, and then they end up with debt, and everything's not fine in the labor market, and they're forced into default, and they're certainly not accumulating wealth at the rate that we would hope that would lead to eventually to ascending into the middle class, to social mobility, to improved outcomes for children relative to parents, and that's really an intellectual crime. I would go so far as to say.
I think that's really well said. And, it seems also like a kind of cruel bait and switch for the people who did what they were supposed to do. They were told this is the way to get ahead. They took on the debt, and now they're stuck with it. So I guess in reviewing this data, Marshall, what came to mind, if anything? I know you're continuing your research, so this may still be a work in progress, but what, if anything, comes to mind as a policy prescription for addressing this problem?
Well, I want to say that I am not an expert in higher education policy per se, so I'll answer that question with regard to the things that I am more of an expert on. The relevance of this, there is relevance from this data for higher education policy. I think the question for the labor market, which is what I am an expert on, is exactly what we've been discussing, that there's sort of this idea in mind on the part of economists, on the part of policymakers, and to some degree, unfortunately, on the part of the general public who are not professionals, but they've been told by the professionals, here's how the economy works, and specifically, not enough people have the skills necessary to succeed in today's globalizing economy. So go get skills. That's false, and the policy implications of coming to believe a better model of the labor market are that what we need to be worried about is creating jobs and making sure that there are economic opportunities out there and demand for workers, and not trying to manipulate the skill profile of workers who are not to blame for the fact that employment is not what it should be.
Well, that is also quite well said, and I guess I would only add to that it seems to me that not only do we need to create jobs, but we need to make sure that we address discrimination in hiring as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. So I think how then the question becomes how do we create jobs? How do we address discrimination in hiring? What we need is a tight labor market, one in which workers have bargaining power because employers need to hire workers. They need to go if they can't find them in their own firms. They need to be trying to recruit from other firms. That will make wages go up. And in order to bring that kind of labor market about, I would say there's sort of two broad areas of policy to look at. One is the sort of traditional Keynesian policy of public sector demand where private sector demand is insufficient. So things like building infrastructure, these things Larry Summers, for one, has spoken quite a bit about. And then I would say sort of on the more controversial end of things, so that idea of public infrastructure spending and Keynesian demand management is not controversial really among economists.
Right. Just
it's
politicians.
Very controversial in politics. An idea that is controversial among economists, as well as presumably in politics, where it's so controversial it all basically doesn't get discussed, is that, in fact, one of the reasons we have insufficient demand for labor is precisely the taxes are so low on the rich.
Right.
The idea here is low taxes on the rich means that the owners of corporations and the senior employees, the CEOs and sub-CEOs, they have an incentive to take as much as possible from the corporations that they work for. That what has happened in the economy is that companies have become engines of enrichment for the already wealthy rather than sort of shared entities where the wealth is distributed to all of the stakeholders, including workers, including to customers in the form of lower prices.
And add to that,
the idea here would be that if you increase taxes on the rich from what is now their, by historical standards, extremely low level, they'll have less incentive to try to squeeze labor as much as they have been doing.
Right, absolutely. And add to that the growing financialization of the economy and the investment there instead of in job-creating sectors. Well, listen, it's a fascinating study. I'm very happy to hear you're continuing your research and doing a deeper dive on this. And Marshall Steinbaum, research economist at the Center for Equitable Growth, thanks so much for coming on the program.
No problem. I'm very glad to have been here.